In this video lesson, we'll talk about hyperinflation. In other words, very dramatic periods in economic history when inflation was incredibly high. The official definition of hyperinflation is a period when country experiences a growth of inflation rate of more than 50% per month. So if prices go up by more than 50% per month, this is what is called hyperinflation. And when a country goes through this period, it's usually very, very dramatic, and the whole basis of the economy is normally destroyed. It's not uncommon to see notes which look like this. For example, in Yugoslavia, during their hyperinflation, they've printed a note which is about 500 billion dinars, or another very recent example of Zimbabwean hyperinflation, which took place between 2004 and 2008, $100 trillion. Can you imagine being a trillionaire yet starving because you cannot afford to buy a loaf of bread and feed your family? The value of this note is literally $1 or $2 maximum. So these are Zimbabwean dollars, not American dollars. Everyone could be carrying this sort of money, yet they would be unable to purchase food to feed their families. During periods of hyperinflation, prices grow incredibly quickly. For example, in Hungary, after the Second World War, the monthly inflation rate was about 4.10 to the power 16. Do you know what this means? It means that you will have 4 with 16 zeros % inflation per month. Let me write it down to make it easier to understand. So 4 times 10 to power 16 implies that prices grow at this rate. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's 12, 13, 14, 15, and one more % per month. That's your inflation rate. Not 2% per year, which we experience and complain that everything is very expensive. It's this amount per month. And this is not the highest hyperinflation experienced in history. In Hungary, when you experience this sort of inflation per month, it implies that your daily inflation rate is 207%, which means that prices double every 15 hours. While in Zimbabwe, the most recent example of hyperinflation, a very dramatic example, inflation actually amounted to this amount, which is 6 with 108 zeros. 108 zeros % per year. And in Zimbabwe, it took about 2 hours for prices to double. Imagine that you come to university in the morning and you pay, let's say, £1 for your bus fare. You travel to university, you spend 2 hours there, you lecture. When you return home, your bus ticket would cost you £4 because prices have doubled and doubled again. You are having lunch somewhere at home and return back to university for another lecture, and the bus ticket cost you £8. On your way home, you would pay 16, and next morning you might pay maybe £100 for your bus ticket. This is what I mean by this sort of inflation. And there were quite a few examples of super high inflation like this in history. So this is what hyperinflation is. And if you Google hyperinflation, you will see quite a lot of very dramatic pictures, dramatic examples of what countries are experiencing when they go through the period of hyperinflation. For example, in Germany, after the First World War, one loaf of bread would cost you about 4.6 milliarden, which means billions of marks of their currency. 4.6 billions just for a loaf of bread. A woman burning piles of money just to heat the house because it was cheaper to burn money rather than to buy the actual coal. Or money just lying on the street and someone swiping them because they're treated as rubbish, as fallen leaves. They're absolutely worthless. This is what you can experience when your country goes through hyperinflation. Or it would be cheaper to wallpaper your walls with money rather than to buy the actual wallpaper. Or another example, children playing with money, making kites out of them because it's cheaper than to use, for example, newspaper or any other form of paper. Or this is a very small picture. You could hardly see here anything, but basically here the woman is waiting money. So you pay for your purchases with money not counted but weighted. For example, if you want to buy a loaf of bread or 1 pint of 1 bottle of milk, you would need to bring, let's say, 5 kilos of money. Your money is not counted but weighted. And this took place quite frequently. Another example, these are the scales which are normally used to weigh livestock, for example, sheep or cows, and they are used to measure money because the actual value of each banknote is so small that there is no point spending time trying to count them. You just need to bring a few kilos of money to pay for your purchases. So this is what happens during the periods of hyperinflation. Or children playing with piles of money instead of bricks. Just instead of toys, they're using piles of money. It's cheaper. So this is what hyperinflation is. And this graph, for example, would illustrate how quickly prices would accelerate. They would just grow exponentially. And in our presentation, we have a few examples. So this is the note which I've shown you in Yugoslavia in 1994, or in Zimbabwe, there were notes like this, $100 billion. Just imagine you using this sort of money, this sort of notes on everyday basis, just trying to count this number of zeros, how uncomfortable this would be. And let's have a look at this example with Zimbabwe. This is the situation with in Zimbabwe, they've experienced the highest ever hyperinflation in the world ever recorded. So let's have a look how prices have developed, how price changed during this period. Initially, at the start of hyperinflation between 2000 and 2005, prices grew, but the rate of growth was more or less manageable. It varied, it increased from 57% per year to 500% per year. Then in 2006, price growth has accelerated, and Zimbabwe experienced this amount of inflation, around 1000% inflation per quarter. Next year, prices has started to accelerate further, and by the end of 2007, quarterly rate of inflation amounted to 40,000%. And in 2008, it went completely out of control. So the prices just grew through the roof. But what is interesting is that when you try to bring inflation under control, it can stop immediately. You can literally stop hyperinflation within a day if you implement correct macroeconomic measures. And this is shown by this example in Zimbabwe. In 2009, they've managed to drop this inflation from this amount. There is even not a name for this sort of number. We don't normally use these numbers in everyday life. There is no name for this. So in 2009, it dropped to 6%. 5%, considerably much more manageable because they've implemented specific set of macroeconomic policy. In particular, they've stopped issuing their national currency. They gave up their national currency. Nowadays, there is a hyperinflation taking place in Venezuela. It's another country which is governed by a similar regime to what Zimbabwe has had with President Mugabe during this period. Now, Venezuela is going through a similar period. Their numbers are not that dramatic just yet, but it's also quite significant, quite serious. So generally, as a result of hyperinflation, the whole basis of the market economy is totally destroyed. So of course, people are unwilling to save. What's the point saving money if it becomes worthless? And if you don't spend it now, you can simply throw it away. There is no even point carrying it home. For example, you worked for a day for an organization, you've been paid at the end of the day. If you don't spend it on your way home, in the morning, you can just throw it away. You won't be able to buy anything at all. Because people are unwilling to save, apparently people cannot plan for the future. Standards of living drop dramatically. They don't have any savings for the rainy day. If something happens, they won't have any reserves to rely on to. If they lose their job, they won't be able to feed their families. People refuse to accept money as a form of payment. They try to spend it as quickly as possible because it loses its value so rapidly. They try to avoid using national currency, and dollarization occurs. People start relying on barter. In other words, they start to exchange goods for goods rather than using money. Barter replaces normal market operations, which is extremely inefficient. So, for example, if you want to buy bread, the shop owner, the baker who makes this bread, who is prepared to sell it to you, won't accept your money. He will want you to bring something which he needs. For example, he needs milk for his children, and he will only sell you bread if you will pay for this bread with milk. So you will have a much more difficult task of trying to find the goods which will be valued by sellers of the items which you really want. So you will need to find the milk first, buy or get this milk somehow, exchange it for something else, and only then you will be able to buy bread. So transaction costs increase dramatically. Apart from this, it makes normal production next to impossible because workers will demand huge and frequent pay rises, sometimes several times per day, in an attempt to stay ahead of the rising costs of living. Salary will need to be paid several times per day. So, for example, you arrive to your job in the morning, you work for 1 hour, you want to get paid for this hour, and then you run away to spend this hour. You want to buy something for your family so that at the end of the working day, you can bring them at least some food. Because if you don't do this immediately, at the end of the day, you won't be able to buy anything at all. You cannot earn enough money just to be able to stay on top of these increasing costs of consumer goods. And because of this, because workers demand so huge pay rises, it makes normal production impossible because you won't be able to start a new production cycle. By the time you produce and sell your products and receive revenue, this revenue won't be enough to purchase new materials, to pay to your workers and start a new production cycle. So production will stop and unemployment will rocket. There is no point producing anything if you run in a business, if you cannot earn any profit from this business. So as a result, there will be no jobs around. It will be not possible to buy normal everyday basic necessities because no one wants to produce them. No one is able to produce them in this environment. No one wants to sell you these items because they become so valuable, while your money which you have will be worthless. And as a result, the standards of living drop dramatically. There will be serious starvation, poverty, and generally the economy will completely collapse in this particular situation. Normally, hyperinflations occur when the country goes through a period of crisis. Usually, it takes place during some political unrest after wars or some other crisis. This usually happens, hyperinflation usually starts when the country is unable to collect taxes. It needs to pay for its expenditure, but it's unable to collect enough money in the form of normal taxes. It doesn't manage, it doesn't control its incomes. And as a result, it will try to pay for this expenditure, government expenditure, simply by printing money. The government, instead of collecting taxes, because it's unable to do so, will print whatever money it needs for government expenditure. This is exactly what Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe did. He wanted to pay to his bodyguards, he wanted to pay for his lavish lifestyle, but the economy was extremely inefficient, the country was very, very poor, and it simply couldn't maintain the lifestyle it wanted. He wanted to pay to his army, bodyguards, and so on. And because he was unable to gather enough money in taxes, he started printing money. And the more money you print, the cheaper the money will become. There will be an imbalance between supply and demand for money. There will be too much supply. And as we know, when supply is too high, the price of a product, the value of this product will go down. So this works for any other market, for any product, for currencies, for money as well. So when there is too much money, it loses its value. And because money loses its value, you are unable to purchase as many products as you wanted, and you start relying on printing even more money to support your expenditure. More money, prices grow even quicker, money loses even more value, which results in even more money printed, and so on. This is a vicious circle. And as a result, in order to bring this hyperinflation under control, you need to stop this circle. You need to stop printing money. And very frequently, it will require a very serious monetary reform, for example, giving national currency altogether and using, for example, some other currency, American dollars or euros, or fixing an exchange rate. In other words, you give up your control of money supply in order to stop hyperinflation. Unless you do so, you lose some of your independence, of course, as a country, but unless you do so, your country will be completely destroyed. Apart from money reforms, there should be some fiscal reforms as not. You will as well. You will need to resolve this problem of being unable to collect the taxes. So it will require quite serious measures in order to stop this. But if you do implement this reform, if you implement correct steps, you will be able to stop this price growth very, very, very quickly. Actually, it's much easier to stop hyperinflation of 5 million% compared to 500%. There will be totally different measures involved, and it's not that difficult to bring hyperinflation under control, but there should be serious reforms taking place. So hyperinflation, the definition of hyperinflation, is a period of very high and accelerating inflation, which is normally above 50% per month. One type of question which you can get in your exam based on this part of the lecture would sound like this. What is the least desirable store of wealth in a period of rapid inflation? Just think about this for a minute. If you live in a country with so rapid inflation, how would you store your wealth? In vintage wine? By investing in property? By keeping some money? By buying land? In stocks or shares? What is the least desirable form of wealth? Pause the video, write down the answer, come back when you're ready. Ready? The correct answer, of course, would be C. Money loses value so quickly that there is no point trying to save this money. It's the least desirable store of wealth. If you have some savings, you would need to convert these savings into some other types of assets. Money is not a good store of value during the period of hyperinflation. And actually, during the period of normal inflation, you should not keep all of your wealth in the form of money because of inflation. Because even if the country has a very modest inflation of 2%, it implies that all of your savings in the form of money lose 2% every single year.